Hi, my name's Emily, and this is my first knitting podcast. So welcome. I wanted to launch into this podcast before, kind of going into the traditional podcast format with a big thank you. Just because I am a really avid Ravelry poster. I have a couple projects that have received a lot of attention on Ravelry, and it's really exciting to see the numbers grow, but moreover, it's actually really nice to hear such positive comments in my messages. And one of the resounding questions was to create video content that will hopefully complement some of the written content that I've posted onto Ravelry. So yeah, this is just a really big thank you to say, I'm mustering up the courage. It's definitely really nerve-wracking recording this, but it's all thanks to the positive support from, you guys essentially. So we'll see how this goes. As I mentioned before, I'll be following the traditional podcast format. So I will always start off every episode with a finished object that has been worn for some time, so I can go ahead and speak towards the garment quality, the yarn quality, and have that time to reflect on the actual project itself. I'll then move on to whips, and then I'll finish up with a plan. In terms of my first finished object, I'm actually wearing it. Probably no surprise to anyone, but this is the Waffle Loop sweater by OtherLoops. It is a drop shoulder construction sweater, knit top down, and it's got this really simple, might I add, lovely waffle stitch pattern serving as the backdrop to two plackets of cabling. Let me just move my hair right here. Plackets of cables, which actually look complex, but in reality, when you're reading through the pattern, you'll realize it's quite simple, which leads me into my very first comment about this garment. I actually think that this is a perfect garment for those who want to try to experiment with cabling, because you're not cabling an entire garment. And in fact, the cabling is just concentrated to this front placket and the back placket right here. Moreover, what makes this cable pattern particularly nice is because although it looks really intricate, the cabling happens at very regular intervals, meaning that you don't have to retain as much stitch counting in your brain or in your notes or anything. It actually becomes really intuitive so that you can focus on practicing your techniques as opposed to counting rows and being occupied with that. So really, really highly recommend. In terms of just taking a giant leap back and just thinking about the pattern itself and in terms of the design, there's a reason why I knit it. I think it's incredibly modern. I think it's elegant. And in reality, I've actually made very few modifications to this garment. Just to kind of make sure I spell them out really clearly, I have made 3 modifications. So the first modification is I've actually sized up from the recommended size for me, according to my dimensions. And for your reference as a viewer, I traditionally wear size small or extra small within big box retailers. So yeah, recommended size for me would have been size 1, but because I have a tighter stitch gauge of 21 stitches as compared to the recommended stitch gauge of 19, I decided to go ahead and size up. Moreover, I did want to have a oversized fit, so that just reinforced the sizing up decision there. The second modification I made all has to do with the length of the project itself. So I actually cropped this sweater. Not to say that that is a modification in and of itself. It's quite simple, you just stop knitting. But the modification that I wanted to highlight there is because I cropped it in the front and I didn't want a crop in the back. If you notice, there's a high-low hem here, and this was achieved by doing a sequence of German short rows. And if you want more further, if you want more details on that, feel free to reference the project page or my Ravelry project page, which I'll have somewhere linked to this video. And then the third modification I made was just a very minor design choice, but one that I'll just call out anyway. But as you can see right here in this drop shoulder area, there is, actually I don't know if the camera can pick up on it, but it's a very slight detail. There is column of rib stitches here that kind of traces the sleeve opening. I decided to continue that rib column, both of those rib columns from the front and the back down the side of the body to almost add, it basically breaks up this wall of knit stitches or wall of waffle stitches. And I think it offers just something to slim the profile and break that up, given the fact that it is so oversized on my body. So yeah, those are the modifications. And I think I don't necessarily characterize yarn choice as a modification, but one of the biggest things that I'm going to talk about, or I guess the second half of what I'll talk about with this garment, is actually yarn choice, because I think it's probably the most exciting aspect. So in terms of discussing the yarn choice for this particular finished object, and I think actually in a lot of my podcasts I'll talk about yarn choice, because I traditionally do not. I think there's only one project I've ever knit up that has used the suggested yarn, according to what the pattern designer calls for. So I will always make yarn substitutions, hence the reason why yarn discussion is so key to my projects. And this project is no exception. I will traditionally always buy my yarn secondhand. I don't know why, I just find I get a little bit more joy out of my projects when I feel like I'm turning someone else's proverbial trash into something that I really treasure, and this is definitely the case for this particular project. So these are the two yarns that I used to create this garment. These are my leftover skeins and kind of half of a skein, if you will. To start off with, this is the All Seasons wool. The composition is 50% superwash extra fine merino and 50% cotton, and the brand is a Danish brand. I'm going to butcher the name, but it is Hjertegarn. That's what this is right here. And I held this together with a DebbieBliss mohair. I believe this is called Angel. By no means is it a premium mohair, so even if you didn't get this secondhand, I still believe strongly that it's quite affordable. But it's definitely, in terms of quality, better than something that's called like a Drops or something like that. Most notably, the reason why I selected it for this project, not only because the color, which I'll get into it in a little bit further, but if you just look at the quality of the strand itself, there's a very tubular, the way that it's plied gives you a very tubular shape of the actual strand. And now, I traditionally don't knit with the recommended yarn, and so that for this particular project, I would actually argue that finding a substitute yarn with this similar strand structure is key to making sure that when you're holding it with a mohair, the texture of both the waffle knit and the cables still shines through that mohair. The reason why I wanted to really go into yarn choice here is because this is the perfect project that kind of explores color, and I guess in many cases my approach to color, because I do not, I think someone would qualify this as a knitting hot take, but I do not like perfectly matched mohair and base yarn. For me, I just think you're just foregoing an opportunity to find depth within a color, or highlight that depth within the color, because a lot of times the mohair can really draw out some interesting tones within the base yarn that you wouldn't otherwise just have. And then also it's really cool to kind of see what different combinations can make, and I think this is very case in point of that. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but I would actually argue these two yarns in and of themselves are quite ugly. This is some form of ochre that I definitely do not like. Actually, I sourced this from Facebook Marketplace, so I paid £12 for 9 skeins, and that includes postage. And this particular color is 836. And what I found when I was researching this before I looked it up is that it photographs like a camel color. And actually I checked the video. The video does kind of turn out true to color when on my body, post wearing it, and true to color here. But yeah, I was catfished, I think, because I purchased this online and I was really excited because the camel color was really quite beautiful. I was kind of searching for it, and I thought, oh my goodness, I hit the jackpot when I found a really pretty neutral for such a low price. and there's no acrylic content in here whatsoever. And only to be very surprised when I opened up the package and it was just this color staring back at me. But all that to say is that I tried so hard to pair this with other yarns within my very limited stash, and this one came up also by virtue of the fact that I frankly just found it to be a very ugly, mousy gray brown. You know, some gray browns can be really attractive, but my hypothesis for this garment when I was swatching for it is that I kind of wanted to create a neutral, and neutral in my vocabulary isn't necessarily just relegated to a white, a black, a tan, a navy. In my mind, even color can be neutral, and what I mean by that is, for me, neutral is a hue that I can pair both with warm tones in my closet and cool tones in my closet. And I think I've achieved just that, just because there is so much warmth in this base color yarn. And when combined with the cool tone of this mousy gray brown, the combination of these two make what I think is actually quite a cool color. Not cool, I guess, but an interesting color. I actually really like this color. But I can actually wear this with both warm toned and cool toned trousers, which is exactly what I set out to do. So this is just very much, you know, visual evidence to suggest to everyone. I think it's so much fun to play with colors, so go ahead and do it. Don't try to find the perfect match, because sometimes you never know what you have in your own stash without kind of experimenting with it. And just to kind of call out a few things, I think I love those little short videos that Knitting for Olive has published, where they pair non-perfect matches between their mohair and their other merino yarns. And it's just a really cool way of seeing how the dimensionality in some of their colors, and even the undertones and the overtones of their yarns, can come out and really shine when paired with a non-perfect match mohair. So yeah, that's kind of all about the yarn. Oh, I forgot one last thing to note. Because I've had so much wear, I can understand whether or not, you know, the pill profile of these two yarns. Once again, just to kind of refresh you on this one, this is a superwash yarn. After, you know, applying friction and heat, I do have to say there's really minimal pilling, but also the fact that it's held together with the mohair would probably reduce the likelihood for pills coming from this yarn anyway. And it's not to say that it won't pill ever, but it is quite low pill, at least in my mind. And for this sweater, if I am to think about pills, I do actually have a few pills, and it's coming primarily from this yarn right here. And I do have little balls of mohair that accumulate, but it's quite simple. You know, no need for one of those shavers or anything. You just kind of pick off the mohair and then you're none the wiser, really. But all in all, after what I would say is actually quite a few, you know, days of repeated wear. I think I'm outing myself there, but after days of repeated wear, and actually, you know, a lot of wear over the past few months, it's really held up, and I still think it looks like it's brand new. I mean, even with the collar, there's a minimal amount of stretching, but I think part of that is due to, you know, some of the techniques I use for my finishing here, but, you know, I don't think the collar stretched out too much. Overall, I'm just really happy with my yarn choice. I'm very happy with the design, and I'm very happy with the fit overall, and I could not recommend this garment more highly, and I definitely recommend it for both experienced and skilled knitters, as well as for beginner knitters as well. So moving on to whips. I traditionally only have two main whips on the go at any one time, or works in progress. One being a larger knit, and then the other one being a smaller, more on the go, transport, you know, friendly sort of knit. So let me just start off with the more simpler one, and that is, or more simple one, excuse me. That is, here we go, that is this one here. This is just a basic sock, and this is from this yarn is a hand-dyed yarn from Edinburgh. I think the brand, the dyer is called Abercairn, and when I went to Edinburgh, Scotland that is, I wanted to very much buy a Scottish yarn and to knit up a entirely Scottish project, just so I can you know, reflect upon fond memories because I do love that city. So yeah, that's very simple 2x2 rib sock here on the go for my father-in-law. So yeah. Now for the bigger project, project bag, I don't buy special project bags. I just use it as purse stuffing for handbags because why not? Okay. So this is the Agnete or Agnete, not sure how it's pronounced, but cardigan by PetiteKnit. And this has been on my needles for what feels like ages. And it's not because, I mean, arguably the pattern is a slog because it's entirely brioche. But it's been on my needles a lot simply because I've been playing an endless game of yarn chicken. So I've actually knit the body twice and I've knit both sleeves twice. And now I'm at the point where it's on a slight pause simply because my C-knit needle, the cable snapped. So I need to pick up a new cable there because actually all of my M2 cables have snapped. So it's now high time. But one of the things I wanted to highlight about this project is, yes, technically it is all over brioche. Yes, technically it is taking a long time, but I guess I'm a glutton for punishment because I really like brioche. But moreover, this is a project that works finishing skills. I would argue that this is not a beginner project, but instead this is a project for experienced knitters who want to really spend the time to understand different techniques of how you can improve your own projects from a finishing quality standard. So this includes a double knit button band, just to name a few things. I have referenced a PetiteKnit tutorial on YouTube that is not part of this particular project, but part of the I think it's either the November jacket or a Jenny jacket, something like that, but to create buttonholes without breaking the yarn. And also, it's just, it gives you a sense of, you know, figuring out how to creatively construct a garment from the master herself, who is PetiteKnit. So, you know, for anyone who wants to foray into designing, I highly recommend you knit quite a few PetiteKnit patterns because they're very clear. And also, I think that they're very clever. The only other thing to note about this, because obviously I'll speak a lot about it as a finished object, but in its whip form, the only other thing I wanted to mention about this is the yarn. Just because this yarn, personally, I don't know how much I like it. Firstly, it stinks because it is 100% British alpaca. And what I mean by 100% British alpaca is that it is entirely British alpaca. So the alpacas are raised in the UK. The yarn is spun in the UK, and basically every aspect of the supply chain happens in the UK. And I came across this yarn on, once again, Facebook Marketplace, my favorite place to source yarn. And I purchased 1,000 grams, so a kilogram of yarn, already wound up into balls. And I purchased that for 20 pounds, not including shipping. And I think shipping was 5 pounds. So 25 pounds all in for a cardigan. But that also does come with negatives because even though it's 1,000 grams, or 1 kilogram, you'd think that it'd go a lot further, but it's just serving as a reminder that alpaca is much heavier. And so I'm actually really happy with the yarn to pattern or yarn to garment match here, because this is going to be a cardigan and almost serve as outerwear. That drape and that hang and that heaviness is actually a desired quality here, because if this yarn were to be used for a sweater, let's just say, it's just going to be too heavy. It's going to be too stuffy. It's not going to be the right match. And so I'm really happy with my match, even though it is in whip form. And also, I think it's just really cool to have a 100% British made from start to finish garment. So yeah, been playing an endless game of yarn chicken, and so as a result I've had to change lengths and stuff, hence the reason why I've knit the body twice and such, but I am so close to finishing. I'm at, the sleeve is not necessarily finished, but I'm at that kind of stopping point because my ball had ended. If I could pull out the tail here, my ball had ended, and so I'll basically be finishing both sleeves 2 at a time in the round with cuff detail. But yeah, I'll talk about this more as a finished object once it is finished. But yeah, those are my 2 whips. And finally, for the last segment of this podcast, it is, I guess most people would structure it as acquisitions, but because I buy, as I keep mentioning, I'm sorry for mentioning this so much, because I buy secondhand, I typically don't acquire much yarn, if any, on a monthly basis. So it's more or less, I guess this last segment is always going to just be highlighting a swatch, and then a segment for me to kind of walk you through the next project that I'm making on the basis of that swatch, because I will traditionally always have my yarn first, and then using the characteristics of my yarn and the fabric quality, etc. I'll go ahead and I'll select the right garment or the right pattern that I think at the time. And yeah, so the last yarn I have in question is this one right here. One moment, let's just move my iPad. This is in caked up form, but I purchased 500 grams of this yarn, and it's a DK sport weight yarn by the Fiber Company, and I'll put a few details. The composition of this yarn is really cool, and it's, you know, aligned with a lot of Fiber Co content yarns, and that it's got cashmere in it, it's got silk in here, it's pretty much like everything but the kitchen sink is in here, and it makes for just a really interesting yarn. Now, the one thing that I didn't realize until I received the package in person, oh, and the other thing to note about this is that I purchased the 500 grams for 25 pounds plus postage, so it's actually pretty good on a per skein basis. But once again, getting back to it, the one thing I didn't realize when I saw the photos on the listing, the way that this yarn is plied, and I think it has to do with, there's a little bit of cotton content, or actually a bit of cotton content. You can see the individual plies of the strand really strongly. And it's to the point whereby, and I'm going to show you this swatch here and kind of hopefully pick up some stuff. It's to the point whereby the plying adds texture to a stockinette panel. And so when you're kind of, at least when I'm evaluating this sort of yarn, yes, it does have like a lovely drape quality, but I think for me, from a visual standpoint, the cotton is really creating a lot of busyness in the garment, in addition to the little Tweedy bits that are present, these white Tweedy bits all throughout the skein. And so initially when I saw the color, I actually had it earmarked for a Michaela sweater by PetiteKnit, and as you can see here, I tried to swatch in the stitch pattern, and it just, once again, just reflecting back on the busyness of the actual plying itself and its contribution to the texture and the fabric, it's just not the right yarn for it. And this is why I think also maybe why I wanted to feature it in a segment like this, is because this is a standard gauge swatch that I do. I make huge gauge swatches, but I think it's really, really important because when you're, at least when I'm knitting up my gauge swatch, and the Michaela's, you know, kind of the rejection of the Michaela sweater as an option for me is case in point here. You're knitting it up not just for the stitch gauge, but also the fabric quality. And it's just very clear here that that's a no-go and that's a mismatch. So I'm essentially back to the drawing board, and I'll post up a few photos somewhere, whether it be, you know, in this video, or I'll link photos to patterns, I don't know, but I'll basically kind of link you to some of the patterns that I'm contemplating here for this particular yarn. Because one thing that's interesting is, although there's a lot of texture in the stockinette from the tweed, etc., when it comes to holding a rib, this yarn holds the rib really, really nicely. And so, you know, there's a whole plethora of sweaters, but I think it's the most important thing is just to make sure I choose something that either leans fully into the texture or actually is almost entirely stockinette to show off the texture. So the other thing that I'm contemplating, hence the reason why I have a bunch of, you know, noodly yarn here, is a Moby sweater. So I've actually knit up an entire back panel, frogged it. I actually do think that this is going to end up being a Moby sweater, because once again, there's so much texture there with the seed stitch, with the mock cable lattice, you know, over the stockinette panel. I think that because there's so much texture there, I'm just leaning more into the texture, and it'll almost, this texture from the pattern itself will overpower this texture that's naturally within the yarn itself. So hopefully that was helpful for anyone who wants to try to play around with yarn substitution a little bit more, and to kind of really think, or at least get my 2 cents in terms of what I think about when I am making my own yarn substitutions. So yeah, wish me luck, and hopefully in another podcast you will basically see this either in whip form or in finished object form. So stay tuned. So from this video, you can tell that I have decided to knit the Moby sweater, and this was shown in my video, but I have gone ahead and just to kind of show you here, this is a modification I made to turn this piece here into a saddle, just because I didn't like the way that the original pattern was written, where this whole piece would be seed stitch, and then you'd pick up for sleeves from here starting onwards. But nonetheless, I need to use some of the yarn for my swatch, but before I unravel my swatch, I just kind of wanted to show you guys some of the qualities about it. It's, you know, which led to my decision to actually pick the Moby sweater. So this is the swatch. It's knit up firstly in the Michaela stitch pattern here, which is that slip stitch pattern. And as you can see, if I were to just kind of zoom out, and I'm trying to get this to not wrinkle, but you just really can't see that beautiful stitch definition. So instead, what I tried to do is I then swatched regular stockinette on 4mm needles here. And then I went ahead and just sized down to 3.75mm needles here. And I also tried to see how well this particular yarn held up a rib. And that's here. And I think the ribbing definition is really nice, despite the strong texture that's coming from the yarn itself, and also these Tweedy bits here. And then just for kind of argument's sake, I went down one more needle size to 3.5mm needles and did the same thing with the ribbing, just to see whether or not that, you know, that lovely ribbing kind of held up even on a smaller needle size, and what it looked like. Because typically in smaller needle sizes, your ribbing looks a little bit neater. But I just wanted to compare to see whether or not there was a drastic difference between the 3.75, which is here, and that 3.5, which is here. And because there wasn't really any, I decided in the end to really find a pattern best suited for this fabric, which is kind of roughly in this, you know, third section right here. And yeah, that kind of rounds out my first podcast. I'm very open to feedback, so to the extent that you have any comments about sound quality, lighting, my talking style, I don't take it personally, but, you know, feel free to have at it. And also, more importantly, if you have any questions or want clarification on anything, I'm super active, so please just either comment something on Ravelry, drop me a message on Ravelry, or even, now that I'm on YouTube, clearly, ping something down on YouTube. So thank you very much for watching, and hopefully